I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Tania Farrelly is an award-winning advertising strategist who has spent over 25 years working in Australia's leading advertising agencies, telling stories for the world's biggest brands. She's more recently built her own successful brand consultancy, I Spy. She has turned her hand from brand stories to human stories with the help of creative writing courses at RMIT and Fiona McIntosh's masterclass. Claire Halliday has been a freelance writer for 25 years. As an author, she has had 5 of her own non-fiction books published, including Things My Mother Taught Me and Things My Father Taught Me, featuring interviews with Australian identities exploring the impact of nature versus nurture. She's currently working on a new book and accompanying podcast, a fascinating tale of a family whose father was accused of being involved in Australia's most iconic murder mystery, the 1966 disappearance of the Beaumont children. So thank you, Claire, over to you and welcome to everybody.
Thank you, and thank you to the library for hosting this event. We were just talking before the recording started, before everyone came in, about how things are changing, and some of us are in of event happening no matter what's happening in the outside world. So thank you for everybody for joining us and taking the time out of your night. And welcome to author Tania Farrelly.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited. I'm very happy to see everybody here as well. Thank you for taking the time to spend your precious hour with me.
Now, we're here to talk about your new book, your debut book, novel, The Eighth Wonder. So I've got some questions I want to ask about that, being mindful that we're not going to give away any spoilers, because I'm sure there's some people who are joining us tonight who may have already read it, but there's probably many who haven't, and we want to get them interested to read it. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to dig into your career a little bit later, you know, the backstory of how you came to write this, what you did before, and that masterclass with Fiona as well. So a lot to get through, plus we want to hear from the audience too. But first, for the people who aren't familiar with your new book yet, I just wanted to give it a little description, I guess. I found this online, which I thought was a really interesting way of looking at it. It says, touted as suffragette meets the greatest showman. Australian author Tania Farrelly's debut novel, The Eighth Wonder, is the story of Rose Kingsbury Smith, a young woman living in the privileged neighbourhood of the Upper East Side in New York at the turn of the last century. Now, suffragette meets the greatest showman. Tell us more about that for the people that aren't familiar with what the book's about. Give it to us in a nutshell.
So the suffragette side of it pertains to Rose Kingsbury Smith and her emergence, I suppose, as a woman of principle, and her role as not so much a suffragette, I suppose that's a nice, easy catch-all for people to understand, but as a woman who's campaigning heavily for equal rights for women, and also for the educational uplift of women when women were actually not allowed to have an education unless their father approved it. And so it was really about her role in the settlement houses of New York at the time, which is a whole other story I can talk to you about if you're interested. And then The Greatest Showman pertains to the hero of the novel, Ethan Salt, who begins life as a child on bound for, he's an orphan, and he's bound for the West on an orphan train, which is what they packed. They packed, 200,000 children off on these orphan trains out west to work for some old ma and pa as cheap labour. And Ethan escapes and goes to the circus and finds a career in the circus, but it doesn't connect with his, as he grows up, it doesn't connect with his values for the appreciation of animals and training them in a humane way. And so that's the Greatest Showman side of it. And the way these two people come together happens over, I suppose, a couple of times, and therefore it was really my pitch line to the publishers in the first place, was the suffragette meets the Greatest Showman, as a way to understand the themes in the novel.
And they are interesting themes given the time that it's set in, because the character Rose, like you said, you're using the suffragette as a catch-all, but really she's just an early sort of feminist. And the Greatest Showman character that you mentioned, Ethan, is really sort of an animal rights activist at a time where obviously feminism and animal rights wasn't something that was being talked about in the broader community. So I guess in a way that's what draws them to each other as well. Being inspired by true events, can you tell us about that? Because I've heard you talk about how you got the idea for this story, which is a really sad story about an elephant. But I'm wondering what other true events you've brought into it. So can you tell us about where that idea came from?
Yeah.
And how you've woven other true events through this work of historical fiction?
Yeah. So I was sitting down on a dreary Saturday Melbourne afternoon, as you do, and I was watching a documentary about Tesla and Edison, which is quite an odd thing to be interested in, but interested nevertheless I was. And what I learnt about them was that they warred in an era in the late 1800s over the alternating current versus the direct current. So the alternating current was Tesla's brainchild, the direct was Edison's, but they had a massive falling out because Edison and Tesla had worked together. And they had a massive falling out. They were backed by really rich people who knew that this was a game changer, that this would actually revolutionize the world. And as it turns out, we do use still to this day Tesla's alternating current, and his name is now on the back of Elon Musk's cars, so, and other things. So game changer as it was, what they tried to do was discredit each other by proving each other's current more dangerous. And the way they did this was by electrocuting animals. And in the documentary, it touted that Topsy, the elephant, was one such animal caught up in this war of the currents. But actually, Topsy was an elephant who'd been mistreated from the time she'd been stolen from her own herd in Sri Lanka and brought through the ranks of Four Paws Circus. So this elephant Topsy, on January 3, 1903, was sentenced to death, put to death by electrocution on Coney Island. And in the documentary, it absolutely, I mean, as you can imagine, and I've had some feedback to this effect too, it's quite a horrific thing to think about. And that an elephant that had been used for our entertainment had been put to death. And I investigated the era, and I fell down this rabbit hole of this incredible era of time that I don't think many fiction writers have really covered, bar Edith Wharton back in the day when she was writing, it was in her time. She was a contemporary writer of her time. And so it really attracted me as a subject because this is the crucible of world progress. We've got names like Edison, Tesla, Mark Twain, JP Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, the steel giant, all walking the streets daily in New York and making decisions for the rest of the world. And in that is caught up a whole bunch of women. And I was wondering then, my other interest is women's rights, and how did women fare under this patriarchy and what was going on with women. And that's where I learned about the settlement houses of the Lower East Side of New York, the great contradiction between the Lower East Side of New York and the very, very rich upper Fifth Avenue of New York, the sort of upper end of the town, and the great cultural clash that created, which we've tried to capture in the characters of the story. So each one symbolising, part of that cultural clash. And so that's what I learned. And the real events were things like the settlement houses, as I mentioned, where well-to-do women actually donated their time to raising up other women and children from the immigrant classes. At the same time, they were attending balls like the Bradley Martin Ball, which you'll see in the second chapter. Rose goes to a ball that would have been worth $9 million for that one night in today's money. And this is the expansive wealth that existed not 2 miles down the road from the Lower East Side where the immigrants were poor. And so it was these sorts of things and these sorts of real events that really kind of grabbed me, and I just couldn't let go of it as a storyline. And as I said, the characters are there to represent different parts of New York at that time.
And you have captured it so well, and you've certainly been reviewed by many people who talk about the authentic portrayal of New York society in the late 1800s that you have created in this book. So you've touched on a little bit of what you're fascinated about with that era. Was it only the discovery of that elephant story that led you down that rabbit hole that made you think about that era, or had it been a fascination of yours that you know often wondered about that period of time?
I suppose my fascination goes to American history, and sad as it may seem, as I was growing up, I was in high school in the 80s. We seem to have a preponderance of history that surrounded American and British history, but not Australian history, which is now I'm catching up. I'm catching up to that. But American history grabbed me because of the American Indians and the injustice that was done to them, and I've always fancied myself writing about that, but don't feel like I've got any credentials whatsoever to do so. But in learning about them and their plight, I also learned about what else was going on in American history. And probably it was Topsy's circumstance that led me down that rabbit hole. And I've always loved circuses and circus stories. This is before I knew the truth of what actually went on. And that was probably born out of Enid Blyton's Mr. Galliano's Circus. So if you're as old as me, you can remember that story.
I love that book.
There you go. Then, you know, that's, and Toby Tyler and all these stories I was absolutely captivated by. And I just, you know, I wanted to explore what really went on in that era. And that was certainly one side of it. And the more I learned about Topsy and what her story was and how that came to be and how it came to be now I think a famous story, then I felt the urge to write something completely different that isn't, I think that isn't out there in mainstream Australian bookstores at the moment.
I do want to dig into the actual story and a little bit about the characters in more detail in a moment, but just one more question while we're talking about that idea of that rabbit hole you went down and researched, because obviously research is the cornerstone of any great historical fiction novel. And as I said, you have been reviewed as portraying this era, you know, really well, really authentically, making it come to life. Tell us about that process. I mean, it's not just reading stories about elephants online. You've captured the way people dress and the architecture, and just tell us about how you actually did that research and you got to a point where you did feel like you were recreating an era in such a real way.
Yeah, look, it's exhaustive. It really is. It's all consuming, and you have to go through the hard yards. And so I studied papers that had been written by, you know, students of history. I spoke to historians. I obviously looked into theses about what women's fashion said about the culture of the time. I studied how New York had a very central shopping district that came about as the emergence of the department store began. This is even before Macy's was there on Herald Square. It was way before then. And what that did for women and how that emancipated to a certain degree women, except they couldn't be seen after 5 p.m. Otherwise, they would be considered, you know, fallen women. And, you know, the fact that they had carriages, you know, we've got to remember there was no automobiles, there was no cars. They had 160,000 horses trotting the streets every day, which you can imagine, you know, they produce 10 kilos of manure every day. So you're dealing with tons of this stuff in the streets. And so during summer, you know, what did people do? You know, the rich went to Newport, Rhode Island to their summer cottages, you know, 100-room mansions, and the poor went off to Coney Island. And there again, we examine the distance between the rich and the poor and what they went through. And so, you know, each time you think about a cultural truism of that time. You've got to research it, and you've got to understand, you know, who were the leaders in that culture, who were the antagonists, what would an ordinary person do, think, feel, hear, smell, say in a certain circumstance. And that's what you need to do in order to really write historical fiction. You've got to be thinking about it, I think, for me anyway, as a debut, 24/7. I'm sure the practiced authors don't need to steep themselves as much as I did. They're probably much better at it. But as a start point, you just, I mean, my poor husband probably didn't really speak to a present me for a long time. So, yeah, that's the process.
Now, in terms of the story, not going to give away any spoilers, as I said, but, you know, there's a mother matchmaker, you know, a mother who wants to sort of, I guess, help her young lady in the family prepare herself for the launch into the wider world. And I'm just wondering, as a writer, what you enjoyed about that mother-daughter dynamic on the page. What were the challenges of writing it? What was the fun stuff about that relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question, Claire. Thanks. Look, I tried to portray the mother-daughter relationship as authentically as I could to the time. So Edith Kingsbury Smith was modelled a little tiny weeny bit on Alva Vanderbilt, who was already very rich in her own right, and Edith is sort of aspiring to be at that high level. And Edith has kind of sacrificed a lot of what she had in Britain in order to follow her husband to New York. And so she's thinking she's going to be the cream of the crop, and she says that continually. And her route to doing this, as were many, many mothers' routes to doing this, was to marry her children off, or her daughters off, to someone very wealthy. And as it happened, Rose was not only good looking, but, you know, she was quite desirable. And but she had early on in the relationship, there'd been a situation that occurs in the book, which you'll find out about, which actually tears mother and daughter a little bit afraid, and the daughter gravitates more to her dad. And her dad is, as being the only child, and Rose having had some health issues, her dad really looks after Rose, and she aspires to be more like her father than her mother, which sets her off on a certain path. Being quite ambitious, being inspired by people like Emily Roebling, who built the Brooklyn Bridge. And you can imagine a little girl who admires her father so, looking towards a career that he has, and looking for other pointers in the culture for women who have done something similar. And that was her driving force. So the fun of it was I suppose, the constant push-pull of their different wants. That was really fun to write. Edith was great fun to write because she was so layered and complex, and showing the two different push-pull aspects was actually a really interesting challenge for me, and to try and not make Edith too, I suppose, one note in terms of being the kind of the wicked mother or anything like that.
Now, while we're talking about wicked mothers and the push-pull of family dynamics, I guess a lot of people say that when people write a debut novel, in some ways it's autobiographical. I mean, personally, I think that's a cop-out, and it sort of says you can't be creative, you must have got this from somewhere. But is there any element of you in any of these characters, or people that you know from your own family or friendship circle?
Look, certainly Edith is nothing like my mother, who's the gentlest soul primary school teacher, lover of books, and puts me on to every good book there is out there in historical fiction. There's probably some truth in the dynamics of having a father who's very nurturing and very helpful and sets good standards. But in as far as is it autobiographical? Absolutely not. There's more of a sense of borrowing from the truth of history and leveraging your own emotions about things. I was never married off to the highest bidder, certainly not. And So you've got to use the impetus of the times and your understanding of the times and characters of real people of the times, and be able to see through their eyes as things were, what the expectations were. And for someone like Edith, who was a mother who was desperate to have a light shone on her, she was using every means that she possibly could. And for someone like the father, who had great sympathy for Rose's predicament but didn't know how to deal with it, I also have, great sympathy for him as a father trying to guide a daughter and not really knowing how.
Mm. Now, in Rose, you have created a strong character, a determined character. And for those who haven't read the book yet, just wondering, what else can you tell us about her? Because I guess the essence of making a character, human and one that we can relate to and feel empathy for is showing them with their flaws, not just their strengths. So what can you tell us about who Rose is in a nutshell, her greatest attributes, and I guess that tightrope she walks between her strengths and her weaknesses?
Yeah. So, it's very tempting as a writer it would be far too easy to write the flawless character. Rose has subtle flaws. If I'd be, in my mind, she does anyway, in that for most people, if they're stuck with a predicament of, so this girl has been born into an expectation that she will marry well, and once she marries, she has no legal identity separate from her husband. That's number one. Number two, she wouldn't be able to go out to work. Number three, she has no financial or legal rights. So she's born into this world knowing this is the expectation, and also having this fire in her belly to do something amazing. She wants to do something as amazing as Emily Roebling's Brooklyn Bridge. So let's have that there. Now park that for a moment and pretend that the family is in peril and they're about to lose everything that the father has worked for and the mother wants. So does she sacrifice herself for the family good, or does she sacrifice the family for herself? And so that's the tightrope she's walking. And in making that decision, we start to see some of what might be considered flaws. Some people might call it selfishness. Some people might call it ego. But we do see that. And, she's a young woman, and what young woman that we know doesn't have a little bit of both in them? So just trying to portray her as realistically as we can for the time that it was set.
I guess it's too simplistic a thing to think of feminism as something that just rose up in the minds of just a couple of renegade women who were going against the grain of all the other women. Yeah. I guess it's just the women that were bold enough and confident enough to sort of put out there what so many women were probably thinking. Yeah. What has your rabbit hole, delving into this aspect or this time period shown you about feminist thinking, and what would other women and other men of the time really been thinking about Rose's views?
Yes, so this is another fascinating thing that I found out through the research. So the real rise of the beginning of women thinking about themselves is allowed to have independent thought in the US at least, and probably also in Britain. I mean, we all know the stories of the Britain suffragettes, but we don't really understand where else the whole thing rose up from. And in America in 1848, there was what was called the Seneca Falls Convention. And in the book, we hear about the Seneca Falls Soldiers, which is an emblematic and fictionalized version of this convention brought into the 1890s. So the Seneca Falls Convention was started by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wrote the Women's Bible. And she got together with another Quaker called Lucretia Mott. Interestingly enough, it was the Quakers that brought the whole women's movement to the fore because they believed in equality. So that was something I didn't understand. And it was through the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention that they wrote a Declaration of Sentiments, which was all about striving for equal rights as men and all about striving for changes to the American Constitution to get those equal rights. And so this women's movement was born out of that, and out of this kind of view, particularly amongst some religious groups, not the Christians, not the pure Christians that we know of, that women deserve to be treated as equally as men. And so it grew and grew and grew, like these things do, a snowball, obviously a lot slower. So what took 50 or 60 years. I mean, that most states didn't get the vote in the US till 1919, I think, just after the war. Might have even been 21. Some states had it by the time World War I came around. But you can see how 50, 60 years it took to build a movement that, you know, the Me Too movement in 2021 built in a year because of social media. So these things snowball. And it wasn't just about women's right, it was about educate. It was a right to education and the right to be able to stand on a platform and have a point of view and be counted. And that's why a lot of these women actually got together in the settlement houses to empower the immigrant women to be able to have a say in their own lives, and also to start building the child labour laws, which is exactly what they did.
And in terms of the characters in your book, for the people that haven't read your book, again, without the spoilers, how do the characters, the cast of characters around Rose, react to her views?
Okay, so there's different casts of characters. So, of course, there's a more traditional type, which is represented by Edith. There's a traditional male represented by Chet Randall, and also his sister Maud. And their reaction to those views is sometimes not as overt as you would expect, certainly on some of the parties. And then you've got a bunch of characters, that two of whom are real life people who lived and breathed just like we did. Lillian Wald from the Henry Street Settlement House, who was a woman who decided that the Lower East Side of New York, the poor, the slum area, needed to have medical attention just like the rich. And so she trained an army of nurses to scale to the tenement rooftops and go and visit poor people when they were sick, and help, you know, with childbirth and all sorts of things. So Lillian was one of them, and obviously she's Rose looks up to her, and Florence Kelly is another who came from the same settlement house environment in Chicago. And she was the one to start to campaign for child labour laws amongst the manufacturers. And so, again, Rose looks up to her, and also cousin Claudette, who's a fictionalised character, to represent, I guess, women in the upper classes who did volunteer their services, well-educated women who volunteered their services to the poor.
I'm interested in the naming of characters in any fiction, but in historical fiction and fiction from another culture especially, I'm really interested in finding out how you settle on the names, because you obviously need to portray names that, you know, tell people where they've come from or what class they're part of. So tell me about the names that you settled on for this book and how you came up with them.
It wasn't that difficult, really. I suppose at the upper end, so if we imagine New York from south down here to north, and that's Fifth Avenue coming up the top. Down south, you've got the immigrant population. And so emblematic of that immigrant population were people like Petra and Jacob Blinsky. So that was easy. You know, I made sure that these were names that existed in real life from Russian or Eastern European immigrants. So I just Googled and found the types of names that existed, nothing more or nothing less than that. And, you know, Alexandra, the little girl, so that whole family. At the northern end, Rose Kingsbury Smith's parents are English. And so, again, you know, a double-barreled last name would be handy. Rose seemed a little obvious, so Amberley Rose became something that rolled off the tongue in terms of the way her mother spoke to her. And then later, when Chet Randall meets her, then he calls her Amber, and that's his pet name, as, you know, as lovers often have. And Chet Randall, look, honestly, some of the names are quite peculiar from that era. You had a lot of the people's first Christian names were carried over from the surnames of the mother. So, you had Belmonts and Chetwynds and Baltimores and all odd names. So, there was a toss-up of fun names to play with. And Ethan Salt, funnily enough, was just something that came to me because he was an orphan and he had blonde hair. He looked like a little salty, and Ethan, I don't know, I just must have had a crush on a boy called Ethan. Was it high school or something? I don't know.
But that's even a form of feminism in a way too, the idea that children are named, showing some aspect of their mother's life before marriage.
Yeah.
I didn't really realise that was a trend.
Yeah. So it was a heritage thing that was passed down in terms of using. It depended whose name had the kudos, had the credit. So where the family name was lost, some of the first names became quite peculiar.
Now, we've explored the issue of feminism and people's relationship with it in that time, and of course Rosa's passion for her ideology, but animal rights was something that we touched upon at the start, and I guess a main reason for the whole genesis of the story. But animal rights is something that in that era, I guess, was not something that many people were thinking about at all, given your terrible story of the elephant. Animals were used for labour, for entertainment, and there was a lot of cruelty. So tell us about animal rights and where that sits with your story and why that's such an important issue for you to write about.
Yeah. Oh, well, the ASPCA came about in the mid to late 1800s. Henry Burr, I think, was the name of the man that started it. And they were mainly dealing with, as the book mentions, the beasts of burden. So for anybody who's seen my tour of New York City, 1897, they will have seen a picture of a horse that's laying in a gutter, left to die. And this is what happened to horses mainly. They were worked and worked and worked until they fell over, and then they were left there to putrefy. He just felt that this was wrong, and that animals had a right to a reasonable life. And the same went for goats that used to pull children around Central Park, in the middle of summer. And so the ASPCA was very much concerned with the beasts of burden, and also stray dogs and cats, who were, if you're at all sensitive to this, and I am, I know, but now that I know it, it's worth talking about. The way they disposed of them was very inhumane, and so they were trying to help mitigate the problems that these poor animals had to go through. And in terms of the circus animals, no one really thought about the impact of exotic animals. And one of the things that I learnt was that exotic animals, for a while there, were really highly sought after in terms of being pets for the wealthy. And not only that, they did wear, in the opening, in chapter 1, Rose talks about a dead hummingbird strung across someone's décolletage. Now that was normal. Ravens on hats, geckos as brooches, live ones, live chameleons, because they changed colour with the outfit of the lady. So all these things were going on. No one was thinking about it. And also when people brought home chimpanzees and tiger cubs, and when they obviously got too big and too destructive for the family home, they just dumped them outside the arsenal in Central Park, which is how Central Park Zoo came about. And then the elephants, when they got too feisty for their owners, would also be dumped in tiny little enclosures, or not euthanized, killed in various ways, horrible ways. And no one really was looking after that. And I came across a story about Lily Forepaw, which is a really tiny little story in a obituary. And Forepaw and Sell's circus was a very famous circus back in the 1800s, and Topsy was part of that circus, and that's where I got all the information about how she'd been brutalised and then put into Daisy's character. So Daisy was a fictionalised elephant. I hope you're all following me here. And so Lily Forepaugh divorced her husband, Adam Forepaugh, who was the circus owner, and started her own sanctuary in Brewster Hill in upstate New York for brutalised animals. And that really gave me the kind of idea for Ethan Salt and the way he treated animals. And even more than that, the more I investigated the treatment of elephants, I learnt that in this day and age, that sort of brutality still goes on. In fact, the same sort of training methods are used by some of the elephant entertainment procurers in Asia to break the elephants down so that they makes them compliant for use as for rides in India or Asia. And I felt really compelled that this story be told in some ways to prove that actually history still goes on and it's still important to think about animal welfare, and in particular elephant welfare. And yeah, the more I learnt, the more I understood about who was actually providing sanctuary in this day and age, and why.
Now, I would like to get the audience involved. If anybody does have a question and they haven't already typed it into the chat, now would be a great time to ask a question, perhaps about the historical era, or if you've read the book, maybe you've got a question about one of the characters, or just more generally about Tania and her approach to writing a work of historical fiction. Because Tania, this is your debut novel, but your background has been very connected with writing for a long time. You've come from the advertising industry. And I was just wondering if you could tell us what lessons you felt you learned from that aspect of your creative life that you applied to the writing of this, or what ones you had to just completely throw out and think, I don't know any of this. I have to start again and learn something completely new.
There was a lot of that last bit, Claire. Throw out what I know and start with something new. So I suppose what advertising does give you as an industry is a sense of the necessity to connect with people emotionally. And my role as a strategist was partly strategically to wrap up a story in a very simple way. So that was the hardest thing to come up with. Was in advertising, we're always talking about the single proposition. What's the one thing we need to say? And so that's the thing I had to get rid of, was actually to be able to expand on my thinking and write about my thinking in a much more evocative way that would topple you into a world and make that world feel real. But the research side of my job as a strategist really helped me, because I'm used to dealing with running focus groups, dealing with secondary research, dealing with things, kind of university papers and theses that other people have written, and distilling that down into information that's usable and sensible. So there was the bit I had to get rid of and let go of was my desire to simplify. And the bit that I could use and harness was about the process of research and being able to chunk things up into meaningful situations that people can understand.
Well, I guess another thing advertising teaches you is about knowing your audience. So when you were writing this book, did you have an ideal reader in mind, or were you writing for you and just hoping that somebody else will engage with this story? Who is this book for?
Yeah, I for all the people on this Zoom meeting, actually, it's for people that learn something while they're reading fiction. That's how I grew up. I loved, stories like A Woman of Substance, and I loved stories about Custer's Last Stand, and also about, I don't know if you can see my bookshelf, but I've got a load of Philippa Gregory's up there, because I loved also the Tudor court. So anyone that's got an interest in learning while reading and being entertained were the people that I was writing for, not male or female, but more about that sort of edutainment side of things that that I enjoy. So hopefully that's touched some people in the right way. And it's hard as a debut author to find your market. So people will come, and some people will read my story and not get into it, and other people will really get into it and really understand that it's coming from a place of wanting to highlight important things in history, but also do it in a way that that is enjoyable to read.
Now, before I ask Vicky at the library if there are any questions, I just wanted to talk more about other books, because we are talking to a library audience, presumably of people who love reading. And you did mention your mum as somebody who is great at recommending historical fiction to you. So I was just wondering what recommendations you might have for other people who are into historical fiction. What are you reading at the moment? It may not just be historical fiction. It could be something else that's really grabbing you.
Well, look, I am always researching at the moment. So at the moment, I'm researching my second story, and I'm so heavily into that. I'm not reading a whole heap of fiction. However, I've got some that I really, all different genres actually. Like I've just read this one by Sandy Docker, the Wattle Island Book Club, and I loved that. If you like contemporary fiction. And I also read another one which I nearly got confused by, which was Leonie Kelsol's Wattleseed Inn. Very good. There's a whole heap up here. Lisa Island, who I know you spoke to last week, Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan. If you like spec historical fiction, Tussaud by Belinda Lyons Lee. Good Little Liars. You can see I've got a very eclectic taste. Was really fun. And also, I've just read Fiona McIntosh's latest mystery one, The Mirror Man, and that's awesome. So different genres. At the moment, history-wise, I'm just steeped in 1918, so I can't even talk about anything else at the moment.
Now, I would love to ask you more about Fiona McIntosh and your writing that started all this, but I will just go to the library first and see if there are any questions or comments first, and we can come back to that to finish. Vicky?
Yes, there are. Vilma has made a comment that she loves historical fiction, and it's been great listening to how the story and the characters came about. Danica has a question. She wanted to run away to Mr. Galliano's circus as a child. But as a new writer, she wants to know what's your favourite, most rewarding part of producing your novel and the characters' stories.
Oh, it's very hard to put your finger on what's the most favourite and rewarding. I think there's probably different buckets of those as well. So here's the strategist in me coming out. So, the highlight was submitting my manuscript to 4 publishers and having Penguin come back in 17 days and say, we will sign you up, thanks. That was pretty amazing. Never thought it would happen. I didn't write the story ever thinking it would be published. I wrote it because I had a desperate burning desire to write something that meant something to me. And then probably obviously it's wonderful to have something that's tangible that's come out and to see people get into my story. So I'm really loving when people understand what I've tried to do and the characters. And even more than that, interestingly enough, is the community of writers and readers that you get to know. And it's just actually really lovely at my golden age to have a whole new world open up. So, yeah, they're probably the main things.
Vicky, any other questions?
I'm going to have one from Danica says thank you, and Vilma says that she loves seeing the Kate Morton books on your shelf as well. But I do have a question. I read your book and I loved it, and I just wanted to know, I know you said you fell down a rabbit hole of research and that prompted the story, but your recording of the architecture and the architectural process just blew my mind in how detailed it was. So can you explain how you managed to pull that off? Was it something you loved beforehand, or did you literally just research everything that you included in the story?
A bit of both. I've always enjoyed architecture ever since I read The Fountainhead, which Ayn Rand is a
Problematic author at the moment in some people's minds.
A what? A problematic
He's a problematic author in some people's minds now.
I know, a problematic author she may be, but she was a very interesting woman. So one of her book, The Fountainhead, was actually about an architect who had these uncompromising principles, and it got me interested in I guess principles and also in architecture. And the period was fascinating because steel had just been kind of found, and they were able to suddenly 10-story buildings, which was the limit of an iron clad building, was suddenly able to go 20, 30, 40 stories. And so that fascinated me. And really it was just a matter of reading a whole heap. And when I went to New York to research, going into the buildings and looking at them and listening to the audio tours and what they were made of. And then I had an architect actually who lives in Cold Spring in New York, funnily enough, where Emily Roebling is buried, review my work, particularly in light of what did an apprentice architect do back in the 1890s. So yeah, they were the things that I had to go through to learn about that. But yeah, I had a bedrock of interest. Mm.
And then there's the movie with Gregory Peck, which you could have been thinking about too while you're thinking about architects. So.
Thank you. There's one last comment from Angelica. She said, thank you. She loved the book, and the characters and the different backgrounds kept it so interesting. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Now, Tania, obviously there's at least one budding writer in the audience, and I think there's usually always more. So I was going to ask you about that community. You've touched on it briefly. I think that in any sort of genre, there seems to be a great community of writers, and I know the historical fiction community is really strong and supportive of each other. So can you just tell us a little bit about that and how you sort of sort them out and how they have helped you?
Look, I think it's been an interesting journey in terms of God, there's that word journey. But I came into writing a story without a community. I just wrote it. Just had this kind of desire to write, and then what's happened since then is I've met people that live in my area or who have been to Fiona McIntosh's masterclass and live in the same area, and they've got another community. So it's almost like a mind map that keeps going and going and going. And because of lockdown, everyone meets on Zoom calls all the time, and so you get to catch up with people who live in other states, who are not necessarily historical fiction writers. They might be rural romance, but everyone's going through the same thing at the same time, and people with a lot more experience than I have. And what you do is you learn about what's normal in publishing. In terms of your own emotions, I mean, I'm just not talking about publishers per se. I'm talking about when you have those moments of self-doubt, or when something's not working, or when your plot's got a massive hole in it, and that's a really supportive thing to have. And not only that, when you launch a book, everyone's there to cheer you on. So it's not a competitive. It doesn't feel like a competitive arena. It feels like a really supportive collegial one, and that's a very different space to the world of advertising, not so much within an agency, but between agencies. Very, very different space.
Now, I did say I wanted to ask you about Fiona McIntosh, and her name's come up a few times. So tell us about that, how her sort of mentoring of you helped create the book that people are loving today.
Well, I did her masterclass, and that was a result of reading. I actually was looking for something to help me. I figured there'd be a craft to writing books. There's craft to everything that you do in life, even if you're, laying tiles. There's craft to it. So I wanted to. I suppose I felt like I was getting too old to start. To building something, and so I thought, well, I'm going to find the best that there is. And I found out about Fiona McIntosh's masterclass by reading Tania Blanchard's The Girl from Munich a few years ago, and she had a dedication at the end to Fiona. So I rang Fiona and enrolled in her course, a 5-day course, and it really taught me a lot about letting go and having permission to fail. Like, it's okay to write a really bad chapter if you can go back and keep fixing it. And so don't stop, just keep writing, keep fixing. And it gave me confidence to do that. She also really advocated very, very strongly for researching the era, and some of the work that I had done that she reviewed for me. You know, she said, you just need to get in there and really understand, what does it sound like, what does it smell like, really get deep into the streets of where you're talking about. And so I took that to heart. No point in spending money on a course if you're not going to take the advice of the expert. So listen to her. And, you know, she's got a lot of people who've been through that masterclass, and a lot of people have also been published. What she's able to do is sort of steer you towards what's the best next step. So the next step I had after that was, well, it's all very well for your mother to read it and love it. Of course your mum's going to love it, but you're not going to get really great constructive feedback. So she just helped me through the process of finding a structural editor to go through the manuscript to help me with what didn't seem plausible, what did, what I should lose. And I went through that structural edit process. And for those people who are on, you know, watching that don't understand that, that's really about looking at the story and saying, well, that character might not be plausible. You've gone a bit Machiavellian here, or, you know, you could lose this whole character altogether. They don't go anywhere. So my structural editor helped me do that, got me into a position then that I had a manuscript I could send out, that I was happy to send out. And so Fiona sort of guided that process along the way. And I know she's done that for a lot of people that have done her masterclass as well.
And so now that you've been through that and you've written the book and you've taken the advice and you've got it published, and I guess you've gone through their editing process as well, are you approaching the next one very differently? Is it easier, or does it feel just as challenging in its own way?
I think just as challenging, Claire. I think in some ways the more you know, the more you know you don't know. And there was a real freedom with writing The Eighth Wonder, in the sense that no one was expecting it. I didn't have a contract. I could just do whatever I wanted, and I didn't actually care one way or another at the end. You know, if it never got published, of course I'd be disappointed, but it would sit around, and one day someone would find it in a dusty attic and go, oh, wow, you know, she wrote this thing. Now I've got a contract, and I have expectations. And so the pressure is a little bit different. And I think that's probably the main difference. I do know that I can't write characters anymore that just pop in and out for the sake of it. But, you know, there's a lot of things that I've learned that have helped steady my course on that. And now the challenge is to, you know, when do you stop researching an era?
Yeah, because like you said, it's a rabbit hole that just goes deeper and deeper and deeper, I imagine.
Yeah, indeed.
Vicky, are there any other questions or comments to finish up with?
Our librarian Julie has made a couple of suggestions for readers who might like to dig a bit more into the animal welfare in history. So Anna Sewell's Black Beauty classic, and Jackie French's Road to Gundagai in the Matilda series, which combines history and elephants if people are looking for their next read. But Vilma has asked a question that I think perhaps we all want to know as well, because the cover of your book is amazing. She's asked how much input did you have in choosing the cover of your book?
Absolutely none, Vilma. I wish I could take credit. I was presented with that cover and I nearly fell off my chair with love, because although it's a little whimsical, you know, for the types of themes that we have, I just felt like Louisa, the designer, had really captured Rose's spirit. And I couldn't have been happier. I still love it. Every time I look at it, I think, oh my God, you know, I wrote that. So yeah, just the typography just really captures the spirit of the time. It's gilded. Having two elephants sitting there on the front, just warms my heart. And, you know, this is, pays homage to, you know, Ethan's involvement as well. So yeah, in my mind, I had something completely different, but all credit to Louisa Maggio at Penguin.
Now, lastly, I was just wondering, when you wrote this, I know you said you were thinking, well, you know, if it gets published, great. If it doesn't, oh, well, it'll go in a drawer. But was there any thought in your head that, oh, maybe this could be visual, maybe this could be on the screen somehow?
Oh, wouldn't all authors think? Wouldn't that be wonderful? But I have no great expectation. I think in today's climate, you know, it's a very competitive market. And as I said, it's pretty hard for us debut authors to get any airplay. So I'm very, very grateful to you, Vicky, and to you, Claire, and people at Latrobe for having me. But yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it? And I can see it. I've got the character. I can pick out the talent if they want me to. But yeah, anyway, I'm just happy with that. I think it's I'm very happy. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of people are happy too, because when I was promoting this with a few links, I posted it on a couple of Facebook pages, and people were really writing about how much they enjoyed your book and loved it. So you should be very proud. It's a great achievement. And thank you for taking the time to chat with us tonight. And thanks to Vicky and everyone at the library for making this possible. And thanks to the audience for some great questions and obvious engagement in a book that they've either read or loved, or hopefully now they're definitely going to go out and buy or borrow from the library. Vicky, is there anything you wanted to say to finish up?
Well, I think I'm going to ask the question everybody wants to ask. Who would play Rose? And Ethan, like, you can't just leave us dangling.
Wow.
Come on.
I haven't got a contemporary actress for Rose, but I do have a model for her, and her name is Claire Farrelly. So she's probably a little old now, but Claire was my model Rose, and she, if you're interested in her work, she appeared in Meet Joe Black, was the story about death coming to life, and who played opposite Brad Pitt. And of course, Ethan had to be a Hemsworth. I mean, you know, really. We're
all queuing up to get our tickets. I had in my mind when I was reading it, Florence Pugh for Rose. Awesome. That's just me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. I love that. I love it when people have these suggestions. It's fantastic. And I'd just like to say too, before we go, like, thank you everybody for taking time out of your lives to spend your hour with me. It's lovely.
And don't forget, we do have copies of The Eighth Wonder and other similar titles in the libraries, and you can buy it at all good bookstores as well. Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you so much, Tania, for sharing the workings of your brain and for falling down the rabbit hole in the first place. Yeah, it's been a lovely evening. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.